Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. The legend of Sherlock Holmes has long mystified and enthralled readers the world over for 2 centuries, with brilliant authors taking Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's original characters in more recent years and reinventing the series for new generations. Few more than the long-running Mary Russell and Sherlock Holmes series has been as popular in the millennium, and we're joined today by the creator, Laurie R. King. Laurie, we're so excited to have you with us. Thank you for being on the show.
Hello, Jake.
Characters in books have been such a constant companion for so many of the authors we've spoken to for the show when they were children. Who were a few of the first that you fell in love with as a child yourself?
Yeah, we grew up with a lot of books. I was born in California. We moved up to Washington State after a while. Um, I was one of those kids who moved around a lot, and uh, family family tales had it that my father liked moving because he would read his way through the library. And to some extent, it was true that we would go at least once a week to the library in whatever town we were in, and we would bring home a stack of books. And we would be that family of people walking out with a whole stack of books tucked under our arms and one in front of our faces. My father famously rode into a tree while reading a book on his bicycle. So, yeah, we were book people. But because we moved so often, we didn't own books. And I think, for our class of people, which was definitely working, you tended not to own a lot of books. You would tend to have a few reference books that the family would use. But for pleasure, um, kids, we didn't really have a lot of books. They were all library stuff. So it's now great to be sitting in a room and I'm surrounded by books. As for what I read, I I mean pretty much everything that you'd find in a library. I was really nuts about the horse books, the Walter Farley books, um, Albert Payson Terhune, all those writers who are absolutely unreadable now. I don't know if you've ever picked up a Farley or Albert Payson Terhune now, but oh, they're really hard going. Um, and oh, YA level biographies. I would read those. I didn't really read a lot of crime fiction until I started writing it. I didn't start reading mysteries until I was probably in my 30s.
Wow, now that's not the answer I would have expected.
Yeah, I think I wasn't a Nancy Drew kind of a person. And the Hardy Boys to some extent, but I was much more into adventures and animal stories. So
You have such an original way with telling stories. When do you first remember starting to make up your own?
I didn't start writing fiction until I was in my 30s. But I lived in a world of stories. Yeah, definitely. And in fact, I probably, if I'd been growing up now instead of in the 50s, I probably would have been in therapy. because, because one of my main entertainments as a kid, when I was like sixth grade sort of thing, was I had this vast bookshelf and I would make little creatures, little horses, and I would make stories out of them, based on a lot of the Walter Farley stories because I loved those. But I lived on that horrible plasticine clay that sticks on your hands and turns this bizarre color when you start mixing the colors together. And that's where I lived. I would spend hours on that. As I said, probably would have been in therapy in the aughts or even the 80s.
You have a unique educational path than many of the authors we talked to for the show. You have a comparative religion degree from UC Santa Cruz and then a master's in theology from the Graduate Theological Union. Please tell us what inspired you to want to head down that path before you started writing.
I was always interested, and you have to remember, I'm a hippie from the get-go, and so when I was growing up, I went to college in the early '70s, and we were all touchy-feely. I went to UC Santa Cruz, the place that famously didn't really have grades. We had written evaluations instead. My university, my first week at university, we had one of those trust exercises where you do blind walks and stuff, and that's how we started. Our motto, our key animal is the banana slug. So I was at home there. I was very interested in psychology, in analytical, and mostly in Jungian psychology, the idea of archetypes. But I also became very interested in religion and how the human being tells stories that relate themselves to the divine. And when I finished at the university, I wanted to go on and do further work on my own religious tradition, which is that of the Judeo-Christian world. So I went to the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, which is a union of seminaries, but it has academic degrees as well. And I was in the academic program in Old Testament. So my degree is in Old Testament theology.
Let's turn the page back for fans to the first time the brilliant character Mary Russell first introduced herself to you. Why was 15 out of curiosity the perfect age for her?
She literally walked onto the page. What you see on the first page of The Beekeeper's Apprentice. I was 15 when I first met Sherlock Holmes. 15 years old with my nose in a book as I walked the Sussex Downs and nearly stepped on him. That was the first sentence I wrote down. And unlike most of my books, that sentence didn't particularly change. I think I changed a word and changed it back, added a comma and took it away. So it has such a strong flavor of a person. Someone who has no doubt, who has a slight sense of humor, is aware of the absurdity of the situation, and goes on. That I didn't really need to do anything except find out what, who, and where she was. So that was the beginning. My main idea of Mary Russell was, what would that extraordinary mind of Sherlock Holmes look like if it were in a young woman instead? And from that, you then have a choice of, do you have somebody who doesn't acknowledge the existence of Holmes? Are you writing a character who is in the 20th century? And in my neck of the woods in California, I could have written a Kate Martinelli character who was Mary Russell. But because it's always more interesting to put two similar things next to each other rather than separate them, I decided I would put her as a young apprentice, somebody who meets Sherlock Holmes, interacts with him, learns with him, and becomes his partner, basically. So that's where the stories came from.
What was important to you from the beginning about distinguishing this series from other Sherlock Holmes storylines while still incorporating classic characters and mythology? You did it quite cleverly.
Because I chose to have them start when Conan Doyle was finished. These are not Sherlock Holmes pastiches. They're not alternate histories that a character that sort of somehow doesn't appear in the stories Conan Doyle told. No, this is after Conan Doyle is finished with Holmes at the very eve of the Great War, 1914. The following spring, you have this Victorian detective who is retired to the Sussex Downs, which is a thing that Conan Doyle said about him. He's keeping bees, which is another thing that Conan Doyle gives us. But we know nothing else about him. What happened to him after Conan Doyle finished? We don't know. He just vanishes from the map. Except he is in Sussex. So Mary Russell, who is sort of fleeing from the world, and it's the war year. I mean, it's 1915, so the war is going on just across the channel. She meets him, and the two of them interact in some ways that I hadn't expected, and that's where the stories begin.
Coming up with character names can be such a puzzle, especially lead series ones. We love it when authors on the show pull the curtain back for us. Would you do so with Mary Russell?
She literally walked onto the page. What you see on the first page of The Beekeeper's Apprentice. I was 15 when I first met Sherlock Holmes. 15 years old with my nose in a book as I walked the Sussex Downs and nearly stepped on him. That was the first sentence I wrote down. And unlike most of my books, that sentence didn't particularly change. I think I changed a word and changed it back, added a comma and took it away. So it has such a strong flavor of a person. Someone who has no doubt, who has a slight sense of humor, is aware of the absurdity of the situation, and goes on. That I didn't really need to do anything except find out what, who, and where she was. So that was the beginning. As for her name, it's kind of a long and complicated story, but basically I had a couple of books on my shelf based on the feminist theology that I'd been studying it as a grad student. One of them was a woman named Letty Russell, and the other one was Rosemary Rother. So I took the Mary from the one and the Russell from the other, and it seemed to work. Sometimes I name characters and I don't. It has corners I don't like to it with the name. Either it looks funny on the page, it sounds funny in the mouth, but with that one, it seemed to work.
Talk a bit, if you would, about the research curve you took into the writing of the now legendary The Beekeeper's Apprentice, both into the Sherlock Holmes history and how you wanted to adapt it to Mary Russell's own original perspective as both a person and investigator.
I think people generally assume that I was a great committed Sherlockian before I started them and just wanted to write about Sherlock Holmes. And no. I think that the Granada television series with Jeremy Brett must have been regularly playing. I'm not sure what was playing in September or the summer of 1987, but whatever it was, I'd been watching it. And so the character was on my mind in a way that it normally wouldn't have been, because I hadn't read the stories since whatever it is you read in high school, The Speckled Band. And so it occurred to me that this man Holmes gets so much credit for being brilliant, when if a woman were to do it, people would sort of dismissively say, "Oh, women's intuition." And I thought, wait a minute, why does Holmes get credit for figuring stuff out when, any woman says, "Yeah, I see this, I see that, I see the third thing," and people would say, "Better." So I thought, I will put him in front of a young woman who has that specifically Sherlockian mind, but who is also a female feminist, 20th century, and has a dimension to her that he doesn't, namely an interest in religion and theology. And so that's where, that's where they came from, that she is based on him, but has definitely her own take to the world. The only problem with that is that I knew nothing about Sherlock Holmes. So I then had to go out the next day and buy the collected works in one of those very, very tiny mass market collections and read my way through them, which is an interesting way of coming at a classical figure like Holmes, because you have a picture of who he is and how he functions, even if you haven't read the stories. But you tend to think of him as a thinking machine who doesn't have a lot of heart. And I found that very much not so in the stories. His entire reason for being is a passion to fight evil, to set things right. He also has an unexpectedly whimsical sense of humor that I'm not sure most Americans catch because it's very British.
When you arrive at A Monstrous Regimented Woman and A Letter to Mary, the second and third volumes in the series, which both became incredibly successful books, can you share a bit with fans about what the early stories that helped flesh out the foundational elements of the series were within these books?
The order of books that I wrote is not the order of books that were published. The first book that I wrote all the way through was The Beekeeper's Apprentice. I had started a book, I don't know, 5 years earlier, that was later published as a sci-fi, Califia's Daughters. But I got halfway through it and I didn't know how to finish telling it, and so I put it aside. So the first book that I wrote beginning to end as a novel was The Beekeeper's Apprentice. The second book I wrote was A Letter of Mary, which became the third one. And it fit a pattern that I had. I don't tend to write that way as much now, but I used to write, it was very common for me. I would be writing in a book and I wouldn't quite know what came next. So I would skip over a section and start writing a new chapter where the story needed to be when it got there. And I would then go back when I saw what was going on and what I needed to do in the interim. I would go back and write that section. So this is kind of like that, except entire books. So the first one sets everything up. The third one, the one that I wrote second, looks at the two of them as a partnership. They are married. They have been married for 3 years. You plunk right down into them in Sussex, and this is what their relationship looks like and will continue to look like. And so once I had written that, I could then look at the one in the middle. How'd they get there? How'd they get from, she's a 19-year-old apprentice, injured in their final case. They're setting off. There's obviously a future, but she, he, and we don't know what it is. And how do we get from that state to the state where they are happily married? I mean, they're interestingly married, certainly. And life is going in a definite direction. So I figured you needed to start with, she has to come of age. So it starts when she's about to turn 21. And they need to decide what their relationship is. And that's the story of the book. She gets involved with a women's community. There are many appealing things about it that do not involve him. On the other hand, there's a lot about living with him that is vastly appealing. And she has to make that decision, and he has to make the decision as well. So it's interesting because the book that I just finished, it's just gone into production now. There's a brief reflection by Holmes looking back at that period where in Monstrous Regiment, for some reason, Russell imagines that the two of them can just kind of step into a partnership and pretend everything is fine. And yet it's Holmes who says, we can't do that because it would destroy us both. So how Holmes, of all people, has more emotional intelligence than this young woman is interesting, but it seems to fit my concept of the two characters. So anyway, that's just something that it's about a paragraph in the current book that'll be out this summer. So.
In bringing a classic Holmes case of the Hounds of Baskerville back into vogue in the Moor, how artful a walk was that for you on the page, balancing the old with the new?
I'm always working around Holmesian adventures and characteristics and quirks. But to take one that is specifically built around Holmes' story, it did take some doing because it was, what I needed the story to do and what raw material I was given by Conan Doyle didn't always go hand in hand. So there's a couple places where I sort of nudge things to the side, but nothing too violent, I think. But yeah, it's great fun to think of a way of telling a story that is around another story. And it's always lovely when you come across a character like Sabine Baring Gould. I had been thinking of setting a story on the moor, and doing research into Dartmoor, I had come across the character of Sabine Baring Gould because you can't miss him. He's written everything. He was everywhere on the moor. And I was extremely pleased to find that he didn't die until after I needed him. So I didn't have to pretend he was still alive. I could use him. And he was such a crazy individual. I mean, he was just such an unlikely person to begin with that I thought I must have this person. I went there. My daughter and I went there. We stayed in Lou Trenchard, which was his house and is now a hotel. I think it's still a hotel.
Cool.
And had a grand time poking around the moor.
Thank you for the preview. It sounds like as the story progressed from book to book, you had a lot of fun with your own incarnation of Sherlock Holmes. When you hear him talk in your head, was it like a British actor's accent or more of just a classic British accent you would have expected from the time?
There's no doubt that my Holmes is different from that of Conan Doyle, from that of any of the television series, any of the movies. For one thing, starting when he's finished with Watson and Conan Doyle and the rest, means that I can let him grow in ways that Conan Doyle couldn't. The first 4 or 5 books, I don't really do an awful lot with him as a character, I think, because I'm mostly looking at Russell. But half a dozen books in, I started to become really interested in him as a character and to think about what kind of changes would it make to a man like that if he were to live through the Great War and see his entire society turned upside down. If he were to go into the 20s and to see the huge changes in everything from social mores to technology. And mostly if he were to have a young woman who became his apprentice and occasionally beat him. In terms of getting the better of him, not physically.
Sherlock and Mary are also an item by now. How much fun did you have with Mary and her feminist perspective, keeping old Sherlock on his toes?
It was, yeah, I think I had long intended to write something there because it was a story that begged to be told. But as I said, I couldn't fit it into the confines of a first story. For one thing, it would have thrown the balance all off. And for another, it would have made it 900 pages, which would. So, but going back to it and writing it out of order, let me do some really fun things, like have them speculate where this relationship is going. Now, because it's 5 in, I think. Yeah, because it's after the war. You know quite well where the relationship is going. If you have been reading the Russell and Holmes stories, you know where they ended up. But in 1919, they didn't know. The two of them have some vague suspicions, but neither of them really knows. So there's all kinds of places in there where I, as the author, can kind of nudge the reader and say, "You and I know, don't we?" So yeah, that was fun.
You took the two of them on quite an adventure abroad in O Jerusalem. Why'd you feel that backdrop was the right one for this particular case?
You know, it's really interesting, um, the whole feminist um, wave that started in the 1900s and is still going today. That we all think that we've kind of invented it and we've come further than the last generation. And then you come across these people and you think, wow, they did that. One of the interesting things about the early 20th century, as indeed there was beforehand, but they're just not as visible, is the number of times you find these women who do things that women didn't do. I mean, whether it's Mary Kingsley in the 19th century going off because her father's lifetime work on the fishes of West Africa has not been finished, so she has to finish it. So off she goes to West Africa in her black bombazine and bustle. And you think, what? Gertrude Bell, who entirely shaped the current borders of the modern Middle East, was a similar character. She happened across the desert when she was a bored, wealthy young woman, decided she wanted to go out in the desert, ended up living on camel caravans with full sets of porcelain and silver, and would do all these things that women didn't do. But because nobody knew what to do with her, nobody stopped her. So she just did them. Well, that's always fascinated me, that if you have somebody who just assumes that the rules don't apply to them. I mean, on the one hand, you look at 2020 and say that's where we are. On the other hand, you have the women like Gertrude Bell, who did a tremendous amount of, research and communication between the Brits and the male societies of the Middle East, because they didn't know what to make of her. And so they just said, well, okay, we'll just pretend she's a man. And I think Mary Russell the same way. I mean, she doesn't really consider the idea that women might be less than men. I mean, realistically, there's considerations and things that you're not expected to do, but that's always the case, isn't it?
By the time readers reach Justice Hall in the game, we've got a classic mix of old and new Holmes characters. Everyone from his brother Mycroft to Moriarty's daughter Patricia to Tom Goodhart, Alistair and Marsh. There's so many of them. Who did you most enjoy playing with on the page among that big, colorful cast of people?
Ali and Mahmoud, you first meet in Beekeeper, in the very first book, because the way that book is structured, it's a very episodic novel. I mean, there's a lot of problems with The Beekeeper's Apprentice because it needs to be episodic. It is the story of her apprenticeship. There is one thing and she does that, and then there's another thing and she does that, and there's, at a certain point, there's an ongoing case, but you don't find out about it until later. But at a certain point, they need to get away. They go and explore something specifically for Russell. And I don't really write about it because it would have made a 900-page first novel, which was not something even I was not going to inflict that on my publisher. So so in the first time they appear, they are only there briefly. And they then, as you say, they come back in O Jerusalem, which is the continuation of that. And they then return in Justice Hall in a very, very different setting. And I found that really fascinating because you could take two characters who we knew from the earlier stories as apparently Bedouin Arabs, although Holmes says they're not. And you see them in their native habitat of the UK, and specifically the aristocracy. And I found it really fascinating to write characters who were the same people in such extremely different settings, in wearing extremely different clothing, and basically having such different faces. So, you know, the characters that you can play with are a lot of fun. And I think they show up in another couple of books along the way. So Mycroft is a kind of troublesome character, isn't he? Because on the one hand, he's really interesting, and the potential for doing something, as you say, colorful with him is extreme. On the other hand, you kind of have to wonder about the ethics of having a man who is so powerful that he is described as being the British government. And it's fine to have somebody who is upright and ethical. But if there are no curbs on that person, can you trust either him or the system? So it's kind of a problem because I've now gotten to the point where I'm going to have a confrontation with Mycroft. In fact, again, in Castle Shade, the one that I've just finished, there's a couple places where the two of them acknowledge that this is a problem they're going to have to deal with when they get home. Because this, it's one thing under the Victorian era of we're all in this government together and we all trustworthy, aren't we? But in the 21st century or 20th century, it's not quite so simple, and they're having to face that.
Locked Rooms was a fascinating tapestry to read, especially because you're essentially writing 5 books in one. Please tell us what inspired this unique path and marries first-person and third-person narrative for Sherlock.
Locked Rooms is set they get to San Francisco in the spring of 1924. 1924. To deal with some of Russell's family history. So that you have 1924, you have her background of 1906 when there's an earthquake. You also have her background of 1914 when she loses her family. So there's stories that have layers. And you also have a layer in here of a handwritten, a hand typed manuscript that her father left in just around the time of the earthquake. So it's it's a multi-layered thing. And the reason that I had to do that was that this is Mary Russell, who is an absolutely dependable person when it comes to her books. She is honest, she is forthright, she's all seeing. And yet, in locked rooms, she is an unreliable narrator. That we cannot trust her memory of her history. So you have to find out the truth of the matter in between what she's telling us. So this is the first one that you begin to see Holmes from as a separate person in there. Always before, when he's given her information, it's come as a, he's written her a letter, or he tells her what he's learned in his part of the investigation or something like that. But in this one, I mean, that would have made no sense. So you have third person chapters talking about what Holmes is seeing and what conclusions he is reaching.
The Language of the Bees and The God of the Hive remain two classics among fans from the series, and they're connected in a unique way. Starting in The Language of Bees with the search for Sherlock's lost son, tell us what inspired you to first head down that path.
I wanted to write something about the son who had been mentioned in a couple of the earlier books, Sherlock Holmes's lost son. And I didn't really have a very clear idea of who this was. I knew that his his mother, it had been explained earlier, his mother was Irene Adler. He had been conceived during the time that Holmes was gone from London in the great hiatus, they call it, when he's gone for 3 years. But you don't really know anything about it, and I wanted to write about it. So I needed to bring him to the UK, and I needed to give him a reason to be involved with Russell and Holmes, because clearly that relationship has not been really good. I mean, you don't know anything about it, but you kind of figure there's bumps on that road somewhere. So that's where it begins. And I thought, rather than have a crime necessarily involved, I wanted something a little darker that is more Russell's area, namely the twisted possibilities that religion can get into. So that's where the Language of Beasts starts from.
You have such a wonderful way with titles, this being a beautiful example. Do they usually come to you easily?
I think Language of Bees, I wanted to use the idea of bees in there, because it's there's a reason why Holmes, among others, is so interested in the sort of philosophical possibilities of beekeeping and the apiary arts. That there is this communal mind that goes on within a hive that is fascinating from the outside. That clearly these 30, 40,000 individuals are all working together as one somehow. And yet they are dependent on individuals, not just the queen, but also, an individual bee who discovers a patch of flowers and communicates it. So the idea of a communal entity that that operates as one is fascinating and has a long history of philosophers being fascinated by it. So that's where that came from. The idea of them having a language is, they didn't discover the dance language of bees, if you know anything about beekeeping, until considerably later. But even from the early days, the people who studied bees, who kept bees, knew that there was communication going on somehow. And where it took place, they weren't sure, but they knew that there was some kind of a common language that a beehive would share. So that's where that came from. The God of the Hive was a sort of different thing. That one, I had started out with, the working title for that one was The Green Man, because the Green Man is a is a mythological sort of figure in particularly British, the countryside. But it was one of those that we went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth with my editor, down to the day before it had to go into the catalog. So that was a more difficult one to name. I had towards the end of it, I had asked her, could we have the word God in the title, and she had to decide whether or not we could have the word God in the title. Good, so that's where that came from. They are a pair of books. I mean, the two of them are. That's the only time I've ever ended a book by saying "to be continued," which drove people nuts. I mean, it just made them crazy, and I'll never do that again. It was not necessary, because most of the plot elements from Language of Bees were concluded. It's just that the people and the situation were unresolved. So in order to acknowledge the fact that I was aware the situation was not really resolved, I put "to be continued." No, never going to do that again. Never, ever going to do that again.
Sounds like a great cautionary tale.
Clear advice, never say it. Even if you mean it, don't say it.
You really sent Mary undercover in The Pirate King as a member of the cast of the Pirates of Penzance. Please tell us, did this amuse you as you were writing?
Because you have to remember, I mean, the book started out with this ridiculous situation of a young girl reading Virgil on the Sussex Downs in a war year and stepping on Sherlock Holmes. I mean, the whole idea is absurd. And so you have this whimsical beginning. Humor is a big part of the stories. At least I get the joke. I don't know if anyone else does, but they've never been nominated for a humor award, but I find them funny. However, the stories themselves began to take themselves seriously, and to the extent that Language of Bees and God of the Hive really were, I mean, I wouldn't call them dark, but they're much more solemn mystery stories. I mean, they're thrillers, I guess. And there's not a lot funny going on in them. Part of the situation was that my husband was very ill during them, and so you know that it's not really easy to write a funny book when your husband is ill. So at the end of it, I thought, okay, this is 10 books we've had. They end on a fairly dark note with God of the Hive. I want to hit the reset button. I want to make a new start on the Russell and Holmes series and get back to their silliness. So I said, let's go all the way with this one. We'll do a farce. We'll do a story that's about a movie about the Pirates of Penzance with real pirates. So that's where we started, and it's funny because some people didn't get it. Some people, it's the only time I've had people write to me on social media saying, "Don't ever do that again." was a terrible book. No one will ever do that again. What can you do? I mean, send a hit squad out after them? No. You know, all you can do is say, well, humor is such an individual thing. I'm sorry you didn't care for the book. You'll like the next one a lot because it's much more traditional. And again, it was, Garment of Shadows was a very, very traditional Russell and Holmes romp and adventure. But Pirate King is meant to be a farce. And there you have it.
My mom counts The Garment of Shadows as among her favorites in your collection, and Mary waking up with the amnesia right off the bat's a very interesting premise. Where did that one come to you?
You know, I use that as an example for my editor. Whenever my editor starts talking about that they want another Russell book, I say, look, the only time when I've done 4 Russell books in a row, I've injured her. So by the time you get to 4, because at that point I had not had any standalones or Martinellis or other books in the past. I just 1, 2, 3, 4 in a row of these books. And so to have her wake up so gravely injured that she has no memory, I think we all need to take that as a sign that Laurie should not be asked to write 4 in a row, because otherwise Russell's going to lose parts of her anatomy. So, but I had been to, this is set in Fez in Morocco. And I went there on a holiday. I never take holidays, but I had been in Lisbon with family. We'd looked around at where we could go for 2 weeks that didn't involve going through Madrid, because it was an airport we didn't want to have to deal with. And that would have taken us north or south. And we said, well, let's go to Morocco. So we went to Morocco. And I had wanted to go to Casablanca, which is I needed for the Pirate King book. But after that, I had no intention of doing anything. So we got to Fez. And it's a medieval walled city with internet cafes. I loved it. I mean, it was the most bonkers place that, I mean, you can't, there's no wheeled traffic, carts, but you can get a motorcycle through if you're not really interested in actually riding it because the streets are too crowded. And I thought, what would be the ideal situation for somebody waking up in this town? And that would be, I don't know where I am. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm doing here. What am I meant to do? But this is just exciting. So that's why she wakes up with amnesia in Fez.
You won the Agatha Award for Best Historical Novel with Dreaming Spies, which is set in Japan. You actually traveled to Japan and researching this book. Do you feel like that's important for authors to physically go to the places that they're going to then write about?
That's what my daughter calls a recovering academic. The research is a whole lot of fun. I always travel where I'm going to write. I almost never have written stories in places that I haven't been to. So for the most part, I go and poke around. And I tend to go to places that people have written about it to some degree. So yeah, I have a lot of fun fossicking through guidebooks and memoirs and travelogues and things, and picking up little pieces of treasure that I can stick in and make people think, whoa, she's done exciting research. Yes, it was a lot of fun. Fortunately, it was a conference I had been to. I was at, so there I was. It was fun.
The Murder of Mary Russell. Talk about doing something different. Why did you feel it was important at that point in the book series to shake it up, really, for yourself, Mary, and by extension, readers?
My beloved longtime editor and I were at lunch in BoucherCon, which is the annual crime conference. And this was I think, Long Beach. And she and I always have lunch. And because it's always in the fall, and I normally start writing in the spring, we usually are talking about what I'm doing next, what I'm going to be writing next. And so I was talking to her about a certain number of ideas and this, that, and the other. Um, and she asked me, and I'm not quite sure why she asked it. It must have been something that she'd been talking to someone else about. But she said, have you ever considered killing off your main character? Well, I know that she didn't want me to because, I mean, who would write a Mary Russell book without a Mary Russell? But my daughter was also with us, and the two of them were talking, and at a certain point, they realized that my mind has just gone off there, and I'm not hearing a word that's going on. The two of them are talking, and this thing is reverberating through my brain of, have you ever thought of killing off your main character? so I think that was one of the few books that the title came first, because the murder of Mary Russell, obviously you assume that this is about Mary Russell being murdered. And although it is also obvious that it could be Mary Russell committing murder, you don't know. So that's what the whole book is built around, is that she disappears and there's blood on the floor.
By the time fans set sail for Island of the Mad and Riviera Gold, you've been on an amazing journey with them for over 25 years. What kind of new adventures did you like to keep sending Mary on, and by extension the readers, to keep it really fresh for yourself?
I do tend to travel the characters a lot, and that helps me tremendously, because you get a whole different set of situations and characters and possibilities and mood when you are in Sussex as compared with Venice. So I had decided I was actually supposed to write a book set in the Tower of London, and then we had this election, and I thought, I can't write about a series of people being drawn and quartered in the Tower of London. I just can't go there in this particular situation. So I thought, what else do I know, and what can I write that's a little more cheerful? And I thought, well, we could go someplace warm for one thing. And I thought, well, what about Venice? I love Venice. And at that point, I realized that Cole Porter was Venice in 1925. I mean, he was one of the summers, one of the years where he spent months there in the summer, and so that once I knew Cole Porter, that defined the whole book for me. So it's all about
Brilliant book. Riviera.
Similarly with Riviera Gold. I mean, the Murphys were there. They were good friends with Cole Porter. I knew that they were going to be there. And I also knew that Mrs. Hudson, who was the main character in Murder of Mary Russell, had gone there. I mean, at the end of that book, she says, I've always been fond of Monte Carlo. So I figured that that's where she had gone. And I really wanted to write a book about Mrs. Hudson because she's older than I am. I'd love to write a series about Mrs. Hudson. I mean, there's a couple of series, I don't know if you've come across them, but things like the Mrs. Pargeter books. I mean, I love writing about old ladies. There's the subversive possibilities of gray-haired ladies are immense. So, so this was Riviera Gold is about, on the one hand, this young, vibrant, family-oriented community of American expatriates that starts up in the Riviera beginning 1925. And all the art and literature and dance and the rest of it that comes out of it. And this kind of threadbare, tawdry Monte Carlo. It's before Monte Carlo is reinvented by the same person who reinvented Venice, basically. And so this combination of of wealthy, shady, retired people in in Monaco and the vibrant community of the south of France, I thought was just such fun. Lily Langtry was there, so I got to play with Lily Langtry. So,
Do you find yourself still doing multiple drafts of new books, even though you've known Mary for so many years now, both as a character in your head and on the page?
I'm an organic writer, which means that I don't follow an outline. I don't know where the book is going until it's gone there, and then the first draft is always just impossible. I can make sense of it. My editor can with one eye shut, but it's not a novel.
As a recommendation to aspiring authors, how important do you feel that revision process is?
Everybody's different, and in fact, I'm very involved in the upcoming How to Write a Mystery by Mystery Writers of America, with Lee Child as the main editor and I'm the assistant. Um, and we talk about, among other things, the rewrite process. And some people are devout um, outliners, and that's the way their minds work. My mind doesn't work to an outline. It makes no sense to an outline, and I need to rewrite, in which case that's necessary. So everybody does it differently.
The Mary Russell and Sherlock Holmes series has really become a cottage industry over the last quarter century. Whether we're talking about ebooks or audiobooks or the BBC adaptation, coffee mugs, the whole nine. For you, reinventing that character so successfully and giving him such a wonderful new partner must make you proud.
I enjoy the fact that people tell me that they hadn't read the Holmes story until they read the Russell stories and went back to see them. Um, something that was written a century and a half ago is not always to modern taste. The timing, the vocabulary, the way the story is put together are not always modern. The character, on the other hand, is vibrant and alive, as much so in our century as in the 19th. So I'm always happy that people get to meet Sherlock Holmes through me.
Let's talk about a much more modern woman in the sense of time with Detective Kate Casey Martinelli. We first meet her back in A Grave Talent in 1994, which won you the Edgar Award for Best First Novel and the 1995 John Creasy Memorial Award. How did winning those awards affect your early career trajectory?
The fact that I was in my 30s by the time I won it, I think makes a big difference. I think if you win either a major award or a major publishing contract when you're really young, when you're in your 20s, I think it tends to throw you off a lot more than when you are 37. You've had kids who are complaining that you're going off to New York for a ceremony and they don't have anyone to take them to a party. It's the balance is different because you've had more success and failure along the way. I am frankly extremely glad that I didn't have that situation that some writers do of selling their first novel to a huge splash. And because once you've done that, how do you write a second one? How do you go back and pretend that you can, you can just be a normal writer? You can't build on a career if you start out with multi-million dollars in movie deals. But yeah, Kate Martinelli was the third one that I wrote. I wrote the first two, which became 1 and 3 of the Russell series, and then decided that I needed to write something that was closer to home. I also had an idea for a book about, in essence, a female Rembrandt, which didn't go along with the Russell and Holmes. I mean, it was a kind of thematic element that just didn't go with that kind of whimsical background of Russell and Holmes. So I needed to move it into my part of the world, California, my part of the century. It was written in the late 80s, the early 90s. and a big city because I needed her to investigate murder, and I lived in an area that had a murder every 3 years. So, so that's where Kate came from.
When you look back over to Play a Fool, With Child, Night Work, and say The Art of Detection, did you enjoy flipping back and forth between Mary and Kate from book to book? And can fans expect a new Kate book in the future?
It's really necessary to shift worlds, um, and I need to get out of the one worlds, because I'm living in that set of characters for a year. It takes me a year to write a book, and if I'm not shifting, it becomes a problem. So yeah, I like, for a while I was alternating Russells and Martinellis. Then I alternate a Russell and the occasional standalone. I have another one, a sort of series that just has two in it. Um, I don't know. I think my mother's favorite was To Play the Fool. I'm very fond of With Child. Oh, I liked writing the kids in that one. I I had a lot of fun with Night Work, just because it's got these sort of gothic elements to it. So.
Introducing viewers for a moment to British soldier Bennett Gray and FBI agent Harris Stuyvesant, who team up together in Touchstone and the Bone of Paris. What made these guys such a great partnership on the page?
I wanted to write a boy book. I wanted to write, you know, a, a guy who doesn't necessarily think with his brain, and yet I needed a balance in there of someone who was coming from a position of weakness. Um, One character is very everyday and doesn't see anything in the shadows. The other one sees nothing but the shadows.
What can fans expect next from Castle Shade? It's the newest book in the Sherlock Holmes and Mary Russell series.
Well, Castle Shade is set in Romania, and in Transylvania, in 1925, and it's I had such fun with the vampires. I really did. After that, I have to have a conversation with my editor, because I haven't quite decided. There's a couple books I had thought of doing. They're going to be really tough to research without travel, and I can't see 2021 clearing up awfully quickly when it comes to travel. So we have to sort of think about what I can do and where. So
What,
I'm thinking of a Martinelli.
after enchaining readers on the page for so many years, what still keeps you in love with the process day in and out of writing a new book?
I like having a community out there. We have a very active, Facebook and the rest of it community. That it's lovely to think of people thinking of Russell as being real, and I really enjoy that. Um, I enjoy the writing. I enjoy the background reading, and you know, I think I really enjoy the job. I'm looking forward in 2021. My stint of responsibilities as the local chapter president of Mystery Writers of America has stopped. I'll still be on the board. I'm looking forward to that because that's going to free up a lot of my time. And I may actually be able to write stuff that is play rather than just work that I'm committed to. I have a couple of short story ideas that I really would like to play with. And
What did you most enjoy about your time heading that organization as you interface with so many young writers?
it's been a joy getting to know people, because I live in the sticks and I never see people except at conferences. So being very involved, and I mean very involved, with Mystery Writers of America, and still being the publications chair, means that I can be in daily touch with people that I probably would never meet, except for that. It's an excellent organization. It welcomes writers from newbies to bestsellers. It's an amazingly generous group of people and very welcoming. I've been really impressed with the work on the board. I mean, the sorts of issues they tackle and the creative ways they find of dealing with problems has been, I found, extraordinary.
Before we go, what words of encouragement did you give those young authors and others over the years that you'd impart here?
Just have fun. I mean, this is fiction is a joy. I had so many people tell me this year that they got through 2020 by reading Russell and Holmes, from beginning to end, because they're the kinds of books that have things you missed the first time through, and the second time through you think, hey, that's kind of fun.
Miss King, it's been a rare pleasure. Thank you so much again for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thank you, Jake, and would you kindly tell your mother hello for me?